The rifle was already pressed against Perry Blackwell's chest before Nellie Pritchard said a single word. Her hands did not shake. That was the thing that struck him most in that terrible, suspended moment, standing on her porch in the blue-black dark of a Montana evening, the barrel of her late husband's Winchester digging hard into his sternum, and her eyes holding nothing warm at all. Not fear, not hesitation. Just the cold, flattened certainty of a woman who had already been broken once and had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of that breaking, that she would never allow it to happen again. "You take one more step onto this property," she said, and her voice was low and even and frightening in its steadiness, "and I will put a hole through you that the whole territory will hear about." Perry did not raise his hands. He did not step back. He simply stood there in the yellow light that spilled from her open door, his hat in one hand and the truth in the other, and he said the only thing he could think of that might matter. "Nellie, your deed is forged." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, and he watched the ripple move across her face, that terrible, involuntary flinch, the one she couldn't suppress no matter how hard she had trained herself to feel nothing, because she had suspected it. Somewhere deep in the part of herself she never showed anyone, she had suspected it for months. And the fact that he knew, this rancher, this man she had every reason in the world to distrust, meant that either he was here to help her or he was the one who had done it. The rifle did not lower. "Talk fast," she said. And so Perry Blackwell began to talk, because he had approximately 30 seconds before the most stubborn, capable, heartbroken woman in Calhoun County decided he was the enemy, and he had come too far and risked too much to let that happen now. But to understand why he was standing on that porch with a rifle pressed to his chest, and why it mattered so desperately that she believe him, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the day Nellie Pritchard arrived in Harrow Creek, Montana, with nothing but a carpetbag, a 6-month-old grief, and the deed to 40 acres that may or may not have been worth the paper it was written on. The year was 1882. The Northern Pacific Railroad had just pushed its iron fingers deep into Montana territory, and with the rails came the ranchers, the land speculators, the gamblers, the dreamers, and the con men. They all looked the same in the beginning. That was the problem. They all wore boots and hats and spoke with that wide-open confidence of men who believed the land owed them something. And Nellie Pritchard had married one of them. His name had been Marcus Pritchard, and for 3 years he had been neither a good man nor a terrible one. He had been something in between, which was in some ways worse, unpredictable in his affections, inconsistent in his honesty, and deeply, catastrophically bad with money. When he died of a fever in the spring of 1882, he left Nellie with a small parcel of land outside Harrow Creek, a modest house, a milk cow named Duchess, $12 in coin, and a debt to a man named Crane Holloway that she had not known existed until the lawyer read the will. Crane Holloway was the largest landowner in Calhoun County. He was 53 years old, heavyset, with small eyes that moved constantly and a smile that never quite reached them. He owned the feed store, the livery, the hotel, and through various arrangements that existed in the shadows of legal paperwork, roughly a third of the farms and homesteads within 20 miles of Harrow Creek. He was not a man who acquired land through violence. He was far more sophisticated than that. He acquired it through debt, through paperwork, through the slow, patient pressure of a man who understood that the frontier broke people eventually, and that broken people made poor negotiators. Nellie arrived in Harrow Creek on a Tuesday in late April, having come down from Helena on the stage, and she had barely gotten her bag inside the door of her property before Holloway's man appeared. He was a thin, colorless fellow named Gibbs who wore a clerk's suit and carried a leather satchel, and he presented Nellie with a document detailing that Marcus Pritchard had borrowed $940 from Crane Holloway the previous autumn, secured against the 40 acres, and that the debt was now due in full within 60 days. Nellie read the document twice. She kept her face perfectly still. Then she thanked Gibbs politely, showed him to the door, latched it behind him, sat down on the bare wooden floor of her kitchen, and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of absolute despair before she stood back up and started thinking. $940 might as well have been 9,000. She had 12. She had 40 acres of decent grazing land, a house that needed its roof repaired, and a cow. She also had, it turned out, a stubbornness that had been forged in the furnace of 3 years with Marcus Pritchard and could not be easily extinguished. She went to see the lawyer, a mild man named Abernathy who operated out of a tiny office above the dry goods store. He confirmed the debt was real, that Marcus had indeed borrowed the money, and that the terms were legally sound. He looked at her with the gentle, helpless sympathy of a man who had delivered this kind of news too many times, and suggested, tentatively, that she might consider speaking with Holloway directly about a settlement, perhaps a smaller payment in exchange for the land. What Abernathy meant, and was too polite to say plainly, was that Nellie should consider selling the land to Holloway and moving on. This was, as she would later learn, what Holloway intended from the very beginning. The debt to Marcus had been a trap, a patient, well-laid trap designed to collect the land once the man holding it inconveniently died or ran out of luck. Nellie did not go to see Holloway. Instead, she went to work. She took in laundry from the hotel and the boarding house. She bartered butter and cream from Duchess for flour and salt at the dry goods store. She repaired the fence line herself, learning as she went, with blisters on her hands and the sun burning the back of her neck. She planted a kitchen garden. She wrote 3 letters to Marcus's brother in Kansas, asking if there was anything she had not been told about her husband's finances, and received no reply to any of them. The town of Harrow Creek watched all of this with the particular brand of frontier sympathy that was approximately 60% genuine and 40% morbid curiosity. They admired her in their way. They did not expect her to succeed. It was during her second week in town, standing outside the post office waiting for the mail delivery that would once again contain no letter from Kansas, that Perry Blackwell first spoke to her. She had seen him before, impossible not to, because he was the kind of man a room noticed when he entered it, not through any particular loudness or showmanship, but through some quality of stillness that was more commanding than noise. He was 34 years old, tall and lean in the way of men, who worked physical labor every day rather than the gym-built bulk of men who worked at it for its own sake. He had dark hair that wanted to curl at his temples when it got long, and eyes that were a shade of gray-green that Nellie would not think about the color of until much, much later. He ran the Blackwell Ranch, which sat about 4 miles north of her property on the edge of the river, and he had been in Calhoun County for 7 years. What she did not know about Perry Blackwell, standing outside that post office, was that he was the only person in the county who had both the knowledge and the inclination to stand between her and Crane Holloway. What she also did not know was that he had his own reasons for that inclination, reasons that were tied up in a dark history with Holloway that predated her arrival by 3 years and still had not been fully resolved. He tipped his hat and said, simply, "You're the Pritchard widow." It was not a question, and she had heard it said that way enough times in 2 weeks to find it mildly irritating. "I am Nellie Pritchard," she said, with a precision that corrected the framing without making a production of it. "And you are Perry Blackwell." He held out his hand and she shook it, which was itself a small frontier negotiation. Some men did not expect a woman to shake hands and were made uncomfortable by it, and Perry Blackwell was visibly not one of them. "I have the ranch north of your land. I wanted to introduce myself and offer the use of my well if yours needs servicing. The previous owner let the pump mechanism go." He had done his research then. She had indeed discovered the pump was faulty. She looked at him for a moment, reading the offer for hidden motives the way she had trained herself to read everything since Marcus died, and found nothing obvious. "Thank you," she said. "I may take you up on that." He nodded, resettled his hat, and walked on. Simple, clean. No lingering, no unnecessary conversation, no performance of neighborly warmth that would have made her suspicious. Just an honest offer of a practical thing. She thought about him that evening, which annoyed her. The weeks that followed were a careful, exhausting arithmetic of survival. Nellie made progress, slow, incremental, hard-won progress, but $940 remained a mountain she could not see the summit of. She did what she could. She hired out a portion of her grazing land to a sheep farmer named Olson for a monthly fee, which helped. She sold 2 quilts she had brought from Helena to a woman in town who resold them for a modest profit. She ate very little and slept not quite enough, and wore the same 2 dresses on rotation, and told herself every morning that she was building something real, even when the evidence was thin. Perry Blackwell appeared at her property 3 weeks after their first meeting, riding up on a roan horse and leading a mule with a tool chest strapped to its back, and he fixed her pump without being asked again, and without charging her anything, and he did it without making a speech about it. He just did the work, cleaned up after himself, told her it would hold through the summer if she kept the leather gasket oiled, and left. She watched him ride away and felt something she was not prepared to feel, which was a tentative, dangerous warmth that she immediately suppressed. She had not come to Montana to feel warmth toward anyone. She had come to survive. But Perry Blackwell kept appearing, in the modest, undemonstrative way that she was beginning to recognize as simply his nature. He told her, one afternoon when she ran into him at the feed store, that Holloway's man had been asking questions about her land at the county record's office. He said it quietly, without drama, like a person passing along useful information to a neighbor. Nothing more. She thanked him and went home and lay awake that night thinking about what it meant and why he would tell her, and whether there was a hidden motive she was not seeing. Trust was a luxury she could not afford. Every rancher in the county either owed Holloway something or wanted something from him, and she did not know yet which category Perry Blackwell fell into. She asked Abernathy about him the next day, framing it as general curiosity. The lawyer's expression shifted in a way that was interesting, a slight tightening, a careful neutrality. "Perry Blackwell is an honest man," Abernathy said. "One of the few in this county I would say that about without qualification." He paused. "He and Holloway have a history. I wouldn't ask about it if I were you." "Not yet." "Not yet." That was an odd thing to say. It implied there was a right time, a moment when the history between Perry Blackwell and Crane Holloway would become relevant to her situation, and that Abernathy already suspected it would. She filed that information away in the careful, organized cabinet of her mind, where she kept all the things she did not yet understand, and waited. The event that changed everything, that transformed the careful geometry of survival into something urgent and dangerous, happened on a Friday morning in June when she walked into Abernathy's office to pay her monthly legal retainer, and found the man sitting behind his desk looking 20 years older than he had the previous week. He told her, in a halting, ashamed voice, that Holloway had approached him the previous evening. That Holloway had made it known, in the politely threatening way that was his specialty, that Abernathy's own mortgage on the office, on his house, on a small pasture he kept horses on, was held by Holloway's bank. That Abernathy would find himself in a very difficult position if he continued to provide legal assistance to the Pritchard widow in any attempt to contest the debt. The lawyer was not a brave man. He was sorry. He genuinely was, but he could not continue to represent her. Nellie sat in the chair across from him for a long moment. She looked at the hands in her lap. She thought about crying, decided against it, and then thought about what exactly Holloway was afraid of, because you did not threaten a minor county lawyer into dropping a widow's case unless you were afraid of something the lawyer might help her find. What was there to find? She thanked Abernathy. She walked out of his office and down the wooden sidewalk of Harrow Creek's Main Street, and she walked with her back straight and her chin level, and she did not let anyone see what was moving through her chest, which was not despair this time but something harder and sharper. It was anger. It was the kind of anger that, in the right hands, becomes a tool. She went home. She sat at her kitchen table with the deed to her property and read it more carefully than she had read anything in her life. There was something wrong with it. She could not have said in that moment exactly what. She had no legal training. But she had always been good with documents. Marcus had relied on her to read contracts because she noticed things, small inconsistencies in language, small places where the phrasing shifted in ways that were subtle but telling. And there was something in the deed that nagged at her like a splinter she couldn't quite locate. The surveying notation in the lower left corner, the numbers describing the eastern boundary of her parcel. They were wrong, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that announced itself, but wrong in the way that a slightly off-color stone in a mosaic was wrong. You only saw it if you were looking. She needed help. She needed someone who understood land surveys and property law and who had reason to help her rather than reason to stop her. She needed, in other words, someone she could trust. And in Harrow Creek, Montana, in the summer of 1882, she was not sure she had anyone like that, except, perhaps, for the man 4 miles north who fixed pumps without being asked. It took her 3 days to decide to go to Perry Blackwell. 3 days of pride and suspicion wrestling with pragmatism, and pragmatism winning by a narrow margin. She rode Duchess. The milk cow was placid and broad-backed and was, depressingly, her only riding option, to the edge of the Blackwell Ranch on a Thursday afternoon, and she stood at the fence line for a full 2 minutes before she opened the gate. The Blackwell Ranch was modest by the standards of the great cattle operations beginning to dominate the territory, but it was well run in ways that were immediately visible. The fences were sound. The outbuildings were in good repair. The cattle in the near pasture were fat and calm. A man who ran his land this way was a man who paid attention, and Nellie respected attention. Perry was in the yard behind the barn, working on a saddle rigging, and he looked up when she came around the corner and something in his face shifted, not surprise exactly, but a quiet alertness, as if he had been expecting her to come, eventually, and was simply waiting to hear what had brought her. She sat down on an upturned crate because she was tired from the ride, and because sitting felt more like a conversation and less like a confrontation, and she put her deed on the workbench next to his saddle and said, "I think there is something wrong with this." He picked it up. He read it slowly, with the focused attention of a man who was not performing carefulness but simply being careful. And then he was still for a moment, and then he looked up at her, and in his gray-green eyes she saw something she had not expected to see there, which was recognition. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "From Abernathy's office when I first arrived. He said it was the deed Marcus filed when he purchased the land." "Who was the surveyor?" She looked. "A man named Dokes, T. Dokes." Perry set the deed down on the workbench with a deliberate care that told her more than words would have. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tom Dokes has been Crane Holloway's man for 4 years. He works as an independent surveyor, but every single parcel Holloway has moved on in this county has passed through Dokes's hands at some point." The implication arrived fully formed. Nellie looked at her hands and then back at Perry. "You are saying Holloway arranged for a false survey to be attached to my property?" "I'm saying it's possible." He paused. "I'm saying it's consistent with how he works." "Why?" She already knew the answer, the land, always the land, but she wanted to hear him say it. "The river." Perry's voice was even, factual. "The eastern boundary of your property, if the survey is accurate, runs to within 40 yards of the river branch. That branch connects to the main water rights channel that feeds the north quarter of the county. Holloway's been trying to control that water access for 6 years. Your land sits directly in his way." Nellie absorbed this in silence. The hidden motive behind the hidden motive. Marcus hadn't just been a convenient debtor. He had been a specific target because of the land he sat on. And now she was that target. "How do you know so much about Holloway's methods?" she asked, and she kept her voice neutral, but she was watching him. Perry was quiet for longer than was comfortable, which she had already learned was his way, When a question required an honest answer, he was working out how to give. 3 years ago, he said at last, Holloway tried the same approach with my ranch. My father had borrowed money from him in '78 before I took over the operation. When my father died, Holloway presented a debt my father had apparently not mentioned to me. I spent 18 months fighting it. He paused. I found the original documents, proved the debt had been partially fabricated, the amount inflated through a forged addendum. Abernathy helped me then before he became afraid. Another pause. I won barely, but I know his patterns. There it was, the history Abernathy had mentioned. And now Nellie was sitting in front of it, trying to decide if Perry Blackwell was telling her this because he genuinely wanted to help her, or because he had some angle of his own she couldn't see. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Direct. No cushioning. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his face that she would come back to many times in the months ahead, a complete absence of the calculated self-presentation she had come to expect from men in positions of relative power. He just looked at her plainly. "Because you're being cheated," he said, "and I know what that feels like." It was not romantic, it was not charming. It was simply honest, stated in the flat, unornamented way of a man who had decided some time ago that the truth was easier to keep track of than its alternatives. Nellie Pritchard, who had not trusted anyone fully since Marcus Pritchard had died and left her in a mess of lies and debts she hadn't known existed, made a decision in that moment that terrified her. She decided to trust Perry Blackwell. Not completely. Not yet. But enough to work with. The next 6 weeks were the hardest and most strangely alive weeks Nellie had experienced since she could not remember when. Perry rode over to her property 3 times a week, sometimes more, and they worked together on the problem of the deed, with the focused intensity of people who understood that the stakes were real and the clock was running. He brought county records. She brought the sharp, exacting attention she had always brought to documents. He knew the history of land transactions in the county better than anyone outside of Holloway's own organization. She knew how to find the discrepancies in language that those transactions tried to hide. They sat across from each other at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers, and they talked, and Nellie discovered that Perry Blackwell was one of the most interesting people she had ever known. Not interesting in a loud, performative way. Interesting in the way that a landscape is interesting. The more carefully you look at it, the more there is to see. He had opinions about things she didn't expect him to have opinions about. He had read more than she had assumed, and assumed less than she had expected, and he listened, genuinely listened, not in the head-nodding way of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with his full attention in a way that made her feel that what she was saying was worth hearing. She was careful about this. She was very, very careful about the way she was beginning to look forward to his visits. The first real breakthrough came on a hot afternoon in mid-July, when Nellie found a discrepancy not in the deed itself, but in a reference document, a notarized statement attached to the original land sale that was supposed to confirm the survey boundaries. The notary stamp was dated 3 weeks before the survey itself, which was, of course, impossible. You could not notarize a survey document that had not yet been written. She stared at this for approximately 10 seconds and then said, quietly, "Perry." He looked up from the county plat map he was cross-referencing. She turned the document so he could see it. She watched him look at it, and she watched the moment it registered, and she would remember the expression on his face in that moment for a very long time, not triumph, not satisfaction, but something almost like grief, because he knew as well as she did what it meant and what it was going to require them to do next. "That's it," he said. "That's the trap door." The notary was a man named Webb. He no longer lived in Harrow Creek, had moved to Billings the previous year, which in retrospect was convenient. Perry knew a man in Billings, a former law clerk named Taggart, who had helped him with his own case 3 years ago. If Webb was in Billings, Taggart could find him. He sent a telegram that afternoon. While they waited for a response, the pressure from Holloway's side intensified. Gibbs appeared at Nellie's door again, this time with a new document, a notice of default, stating that she had failed to make any payment on the debt and that foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days. The language was cool and legal and perfectly calibrated to make her feel that the outcome was already decided, and that resistance was not only futile but embarrassing. She read it in front of Gibbs, with the same still face she brought to all of Holloway's communications, and then she looked up at the thin man and said, "Tell Mr. Holloway I received this." Gibbs left. Nellie latched the door and leaned her back against it and allowed herself a single, silent moment of fear, raw and real and necessary, because denying it would have been a kind of lie. And then she pushed away from the door and went to saddle Duchess and ride to Perry's ranch. He was not at the house when she arrived. She found him in the pasture, working with a young horse that was not yet accustomed to the saddle, moving in slow circles around the animal with a patience that was almost meditative. He heard her coming and looked up, and when he saw her face, he stopped what he was doing and came to the fence. She showed him the default notice through the fence rails because she needed both hands to hold the paper steady and did not want to climb through, and he read it and looked up and said, 30 days. 30 days, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, leaning against the fence post, and she watched something work itself out behind his eyes. Then he said, "There's a circuit judge coming through Harrow Creek in 3 weeks. Judge Harmon. He's out of Helena and he's not Holloway's man. I know people who have appeared before him." He paused. "If Taggart finds Webb in Billings and Webb will talk, we could bring a challenge to the deed in front of Harmon before the 30 days are up." "That's 3 weeks of everything going right," Nellie said. "Yes," he agreed with no attempt to soften it. She looked at him for a moment. The late afternoon light was doing something complicated with the hay dust in the air around the pasture, turning it golden, and Perry Blackwell was standing at the fence post with his arms resting on the top rail and his hat pushed back on his head, and he looked tired and solid and entirely real, and Nellie felt something shift in her chest with a movement she found genuinely alarming. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again. Not the same question as before, not the suspicious version, not the "what is your hidden motive" version. This was the other question, the one underneath. He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because I want to," he said. And then, after a pause that cost him something, he said, "And because it would matter to me a great deal if you lost this land." She rode home thinking about that for so long that she missed the turning in the road and had to backtrack, and Duchess gave her a look of bovine exasperation that she absolutely deserved. The telegram from Taggart came 4 days later. Webb was indeed in Billings. More importantly, Webb was not a happy man. He had, according to Taggart's message, been feeling the weight of certain things he had done on Holloway's behalf and had expressed, in a private conversation, something resembling a willingness to speak. Taggart was working on it. This was hope. Thin and conditional and balanced on the reliability of a man Nellie had never met, but hope nonetheless. Meanwhile, life on the homestead continued with its daily demands because the frontier did not pause for legal crises. Nellie harvested her kitchen garden, tended to Duchess, did the laundry rounds, and rebuilt a section of chicken coop that had collapsed in a windstorm. She was competent at all of it in the way that necessity produces competence, not graceful, not expert, but effective. She was also lonely in a way she had not admitted to herself fully, until the days Perry did not come by, and she noticed his absence with an acuteness she found uncomfortable. He did come by, regularly, and not always for the documents. He came once with a side of beef from a recent slaughter and left it on her porch with a note so simple it made her smile, neighbor delivery. No obligation. She found that she was smiling more than she expected to when he was around, and less when he wasn't, and the arithmetic of that was not subtle. There was an evening, 2.5 weeks into the frantic work of building their legal case, when they had been at the kitchen table for several hours and the sun had gone down and she had lit the lamp without noticing, and somewhere in the middle of cross-referencing a surveyor's log from 1879, their hands had ended up very close together on the table. Not touching, just close. and neither of them moved them away. Nellie looked up from the document and found Perry looking at her, and the expression on his face was one she had seen before in her peripheral vision, that quick, careful, controlled look that a man manages when he has decided to feel something quietly rather than declare it. And she felt a warm rush of something she had no name for that was directly followed by a cold rush of something she recognized too well, which was the memory of what it cost to let yourself feel things. She looked back at the document. Perry went back to the plat map. Neither of them said anything, but the almost touch remained in the room for the rest of the evening like a guest who had not been introduced. Taggart's second telegram arrived 9 days before Judge Harmon was due in Harrow Creek, and it contained news that changed everything. Webb would testify. He had signed an affidavit stating that he had notarized the Pritchard survey document under instruction from Crane Holloway on a date that preceded the survey itself, that the date on the stamp had been deliberately set incorrectly at Holloway's direction, and that this was one of at least 7 such irregular notarizations he had performed for Holloway over the preceding 5 years. 7. Not 1. 7. Perry read the telegram to Nellie in her kitchen, and she sat very still and then said, very quietly, "He has done this to other people." "Yes," Perry said. She thought about the other people, the farmers and homesteaders and small ranchers who had lost their land not to bad luck or bad management, but to a deliberate, patient scheme of fabricated debt and falsified documents. She thought about all the people who had not been able to fight it, who had taken their families and moved on and tried to start over somewhere else, carrying the weight of a defeat they did not deserve. And she felt something enormous and hot move through her, something that was not quite rage and not quite sorrow but occupied the place where they overlapped. "We're going to win," she said. Perry looked at her. "I believe we are," he said. What happened next was not clean or simple because Holloway was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. The day after Taggart's telegram arrived, and Nellie would wonder later how he knew, wonder about who in the telegraph office was on his payroll, Crane Holloway sent Gibbs to Perry's ranch with a counteroffer. The offer was not for Perry. It was about Nellie. Gibbs, who had all the warmth of a letter written in the wrong ink, presented Perry with a document in which Holloway offered to settle the Pritchard debt for $200, a significant reduction, and to allow Nellie to remain on the land as a tenant, paying monthly, if Perry would stop helping her. Gibbs made the implicit threat very gently, as was Gibbs's way, that Perry's own water rights, the river access that the Blackwell Ranch depended on, were potentially contestable. That Holloway had recently reviewed certain historical documents, that it would be unfortunate if such a review led to complications. Perry told Gibbs to leave his property. He said it once, and he said it with a quietness that communicated unmistakably that it would not be said again. Gibbs left. Perry saddled his horse and rode to Nellie's property and told her what had happened, and he told her all of it, the offer, the threat, his water rights, everything, because he had decided, somewhere in the past weeks without quite marking the moment, that there were no more secrets between them in this matter. That she deserved to know exactly what the stakes were and to make her own choice about what came next. Nellie listened to everything. Her face was still in that way she had, that perfect stillness that he knew now was not coldness but the opposite of coldness. It was the look of someone feeling things very deeply and managing them with the careful attention they deserved. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He threatened your ranch because of me." "He threatened it because he's afraid of losing," Perry said. "Perry," her voice was level, "if you pull back now, you keep your water rights. You lose nothing." She paused. "I will find another way." "Will you?" he said, not a question. "I will try." He looked at her for a long moment, and there were many things he wanted to say, and he was a man who was generally careful about saying them, but some things become more expensive the longer you wait to spend them. "Nellie," he said, "I do not want to pull back." The simplicity of it hit her somewhere between the ribs. She looked at him across her kitchen table with the afternoon light coming in through the west window and the smell of her garden through the open door, and she thought about trust, about what it actually meant, about whether it was a thing you decided or a thing you discovered. "That might be the most foolish thing either of us has done," she said. "Probably," he agreed. And something in the corner of his mouth shifted in a way that was not quite a smile but in the same family. She felt that warm rush again, and this time she did not push it away. She just let it be there, and that was its own kind of decision. Judge Harmon arrived in Harrow Creek on a Thursday morning on the Helena stage, and he was a compact, no-nonsense man of 60, with a reputation for reading documents carefully, and for being singularly unimpressed by the reputations of local landowners. Perry had heard this through Taggart, who had appeared in court before Harmon and described him as the kind of judge who made Holloway's type of operation very nervous. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. In the 5 days between Harmon's arrival and the hearing, Nellie did not sleep well. She went over the documents so many times she could have recited the notary-stamped date in her sleep. She wrote out her account of events twice, then 3 times, looking for weaknesses in the narrative, places where Holloway's legal team, a man from Billings named Pierce who had appeared in town the day after Harmon arrived, could find purchase. Perry came every day. He did not try to reassure her with empty words. She would not have wanted that, and he seemed to understand it. He worked alongside her. He brought food sometimes because he had noticed in his quiet way that she was eating less than she should under stress. He sat with the uncertainty the same way she did, and she found, unexpectedly, that having someone else in the uncertainty with her made it different. Not smaller, but different. On the evening before the hearing, they were sitting on her porch in the mild summer dark, having gone through the documents one final time, and Perry said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, you should know that you did everything right. Whatever the outcome, it was the right thing to do." She looked at the dark line of the mountains against the sky and thought about that. "I came here with $12 and a dead man's debt," she said. "I think doing everything right was the only option available to me." "No," he said. "You could have taken Holloway's deal. Lots of people have. It's not weakness, it's arithmetic. You chose not to." He paused. That was something. She looked at him. In the near dark, his profile was very clear against the faint sky, and she thought about how different he was from every expectation she had brought to this place, every defensive conclusion she had drawn about men like him. And she thought about how much of her energy for months had been spent looking for the hidden motive, the trap, the betrayal she was certain was coming from every quarter, and how Perry Blackwell every single time had simply continued to be exactly what he appeared to be. "Perry," she said, "I want you to know that She stopped, finding the words more difficult than she had expected. "I was not prepared to trust you. I wasn't prepared to trust anyone. And I am not," another pause, "I am not entirely certain what I am now, but I know that I am glad you fixed my pump." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said with that barely there smile, "I am also glad I fixed your pump." Laughed. It surprised her, a genuine, uncomplicated laugh that startled a night bird somewhere in the dark beyond the porch. She could not remember the last time she had laughed like that. Perry was smiling too, fully now, and it transformed his face in a way that did something very particular to her composure. She looked away, back at the mountains. Both of them were quiet, and it was the comfortable kind of quiet, the kind that did not require filling. The hearing on Tuesday was 3 hours long. Pierce, Holloway's attorney, was skilled and methodical and fought hard on every point. He challenged the admissibility of Webb's affidavit. He argued procedural deficiencies. He presented Holloway's original loan documents with an air of iron-bound legality that Nellie had to consciously prevent herself from being intimidated by. But the notary date was undeniable. It was stamped on the document itself, in the record that existed independent of anything Holloway's team had touched, and the date preceded the survey by 3 weeks, And that was a physical impossibility that no amount of legal argument could make into a possibility. Judge Harmon asked pointed questions about the stamp. He asked Pierce to explain it. Pierce tried. He tried very hard. Harmon was not persuaded. The judge invalidated the survey document attached to Nellie's deed, ruled the debt agreement unenforceable due to the irregularity in the foundational documentation, and ordered an independent survey of the Pritchard property to be conducted within 30 days at Holloway's expense. Holloway was not in the courtroom. He had sent Pierce to fight the battle and had himself remained at his main house, which Nellie later learned was something he always did. He never appeared personally at hearings because he preferred the legal distance. She thought about him there in his large house, receiving the news of the ruling, and she felt, not triumph exactly, but something solid and permanent taking up residence in her chest. Something that felt like ground under her feet. Outside the courthouse, Perry was standing next to her, and she was aware of his presence with a physical acuity that she had stopped trying to explain away. The main street of Harrow Creek was going about its mid-morning business around them, and the sun was doing that thing it did in early August in Montana, filling everything with a light that was both generous and merciless, and she turned to Perry and he was already looking at her. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She put her hand on his arm, which was a small thing and enormous at the same time, because it was a deliberate gesture from a woman who did not make them lightly, and she felt him go very still under it. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it in the full way, not the polite way. She meant it for the pump and the documents and the hours at the kitchen table, and the evening on the porch and every quiet, consistent, unremarkable thing he had done that was in fact not unremarkable at all. He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face and he said, "Nellie," just her name, but the way he said it was not simple at all. She took her hand back, not because she wanted to, but because they were standing in the middle of Harrow Creek's main street and there were people around, and she was not a woman who performed emotions publicly. But she held his eyes for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Something had been decided. Neither of them had said it out loud, but it had been decided. The weeks following the hearing were different in character from everything that had come before. The immediate crisis had passed, and in its absence, the strange compressed intensity of their collaboration relaxed into something that had more space in it, more room for the thing they had been carefully not saying. Perry continued to come by. The pretext of documents fell away because the documents were resolved, but the visits continued, which meant they were simply visits, and they both understood what visits meant when they were not justified by practicality. They rode out together one afternoon, Perry on his roan, and Nellie on a gray mare she had traded some labor for, because Duchess had been an undignified riding situation that had lasted long enough. They rode the fence line of her property together, marking places where repairs were needed as the seasons changed toward fall, and they talked the way people who have been through something difficult together can talk, easily, with the particular shorthand that develops between two people who have spent enough hours in the same rooms. He told her about his father, who had been a stubborn Scotsman who had broken himself working the land and left Perry the ranch at 31 with a debt to Holloway, and an asset he wasn't sure he wanted. He told her about the 18 months of fighting Holloway alone, and what it had cost him in time and energy, and something harder to name. The toll that sustained suspicion takes on a person, the way it makes every interaction a calculation. She told him about Marcus, not the version she told in public, the respectful, minimal version of the faithful widow, but the more complicated truth, that Marcus had been charming and unreliable, and that she had known about the unreliability for most of their 3 years together and had stayed anyway, partly out of stubbornness, and partly out of a kind of loyalty that she had mistaken for love. She had loved Marcus. But she had also known, somewhere beneath the love, that he was not entirely reliable, and that had been its own kind of loneliness. Perry listened to all of this without the careful, diplomatic neutrality that people put on when they are not sure what they are supposed to feel about the dead. He listened the way he listened to everything, as if what she was saying was exactly as important as it was, no more and no less. "You were not a fool for staying," he said. "No," she agreed. "I was a person who believed things would improve. That is different from foolishness." "He didn't deserve you," Perry said, and then caught himself as if he had said more than he intended and looked ahead at the fence line. Nellie looked at his profile for a moment and felt something settle very quietly in her chest, something that had been unsettled for a long time. "You are not required to be diplomatic about him," she said. "I wasn't being diplomatic," he said. "I was being honest." She thought about that all the way back to the barn. The independent survey came back in September, as ordered by Judge Harmon, and it confirmed what she and Perry had suspected. The eastern boundary of her property extended 12 yards further than the forged survey had claimed, bringing it definitively to the river branch. Nellie's water rights were sound. Her land was hers, legally and completely, and Crane Holloway, for the first time in his tenure as the dominant force in Calhoun County, had been publicly and on the record defeated. He was not done, of course. Men like Holloway were never done, but the nature of his options had changed. Webb's affidavit had opened questions about 6 other properties, and 2 of those property owners had already approached the circuit court in Helena. Holloway was managing a much larger problem than one widow's 40 acres, and his capacity to direct pressure at Nellie specifically had diminished significantly. Abernathy came to see her 2 weeks after the survey results were confirmed. He was humble about it and genuinely sorrowful, and she let him be, because she needed his professional services and because he had not, ultimately, failed her in the way that mattered most. He had just been a frightened man, and she understood frightened men, having been a frightened woman herself for longer than she cared to admit. She also, that same week, received a letter from Marcus's brother in Kansas. 3 letters in, apparently, had produced an eventual response. The brother apologized for the delay, said he had been ill, and confirmed that there had indeed been money, a small inheritance from a Kansas property their father had held that Marcus had been due, and that Marcus had apparently not mentioned to Nellie. The amount was modest, not transformative, but it was hers by right, and the brother, who seemed like a decent man operating from a guilt he had not fully processed, included a bank draft for $126. She stared at the bank draft for a long time. Then she rode to Perry's ranch. He was at the house, on the front porch, mending tack, and he looked up when she came up the path. She held out the bank draft without saying anything, and he read it and looked up with an expression that she had learned to read as the closest thing he had to open surprise. "Marcus's brother," she said. "There was money I didn't know about." "That helps," Perry said. "It helps enormously," she agreed. "I can repair the roof before winter. I can buy seed for next spring. She stopped, and the emotion that had been managed and contained and held at a careful distance all day rose suddenly and decisively, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the mountains and let it pass. Perry did not say anything. He was good at that. "I think," she said when she had it under control, "I am going to be all right." "I know you are," he said. She looked at him. "You always knew." "I suspected," he said. "I believed." He set down the tack. "Nellie." He stood up, which put him at his full height, and she had to look up at him, and the afternoon light was coming at an angle through the porch column and laying in lines across the floorboards between them. "I would very much like to ask if I may come to call on you, formally, if that's something you would want." The words were careful and old-fashioned and completely sincere, and they hit her square in the center of the chest with a force she had not prepared for. She had thought about this. She had thought about it extensively, in the way she thought about all important things from every angle, with all the available evidence, accounting for her own biases and fears. She had thought about the fact that Perry Blackwell had not once, in all the time she had known him, given her a single reason to distrust him. She had gone looking for the hidden motive, for the trap, for the dark secret that would explain why a man would simply help someone because it was right. She had never found it. There was no hidden motive. There was just a man who was what he appeared to be, which was, she had come to understand, the rarest thing the world contained. "Yes," she said. "I would want that." The smile that came to his face was full and unguarded, and she stored it away in a part of herself that she kept carefully. Autumn came to Harrow Creek in the breathtaking, brutal way of Montana autumns, turning everything gold and red and cold overnight. And Perry Blackwell came to call on Nellie Pritchard with a regularity that the town noticed and discussed with the particular interest that small frontier towns invested in romantic developments. Nellie was aware of the discussion and chose to treat it as information she did not require. He brought her things occasionally, not lavish things, not the kind of courtship gifts that would have been overwhelming and therefore suspicious, but practical things chosen with thought. A good quality oil lamp, a book he had read and thought she would argue with, a cutting of a particular herb she had mentioned wanting for her garden. Small things that said, clearly and without performance, "I pay attention to you." She paid attention back. She noticed the way he held himself differently on days when the ranch work had gone poorly, a particular set to his shoulders that eased as the evening progressed. She noticed that he had a habit of reaching for his hat when he was thinking hard about something, and then stopping himself before he touched it, like a gesture half interrupted. She noticed that he laughed rarely but genuinely, and that when she said something that amused him, the laugh came from somewhere real. She was falling in love with him. She knew it with the same clarity she brought to documents, the same recognition of a truth that was simply present regardless of what you did with it. The first time he kissed her was on an evening in late October, after supper at her kitchen table. She had cooked, and it had been a real meal, roast with root vegetables from her garden, and there had been a kind of domestic ease to the evening that was new and felt enormous in its ordinariness. They were standing on her porch saying goodbye in the cold dark, the first real frost of the season making the air sharp and clean, and he had her hand in his, just holding it, the way he did sometimes now, the simplest possible gesture. And she had looked up at him in the dark and he had looked at her. And there was a moment, very brief, where everything that had been building between them for months was simply present and visible between them. And then he kissed her with a gentleness that was nothing like the careful, managed restraint she had come to associate with him. It was completely unguarded. And she kissed him back with the same absence of defense, and felt something in her chest open that she had not known she had been keeping shut. They stood on her porch in the October cold for considerably longer than was practical, and when he finally rode away, she stood at the door listening to the sound of hooves on the cold ground getting fainter and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the future was a place worth going. She wrote to her sister in Chicago that night. The letter was short, but her sister, who had known her all her life, would read between the lines effortlessly. "I have met a man," she wrote, "who fixed my pump without being asked. You will understand what I mean by that." The winter of 1882 into 1883 was not gentle, as Montana winters were not gentle. There were storms that locked the county in for days at a time, that turned the roads to something impassable, that tested every structure and every supply. Nellie had been warned and had prepared. The roof repair held. The larder was stocked. Duchess was warm in the small barn. She managed. On the days when the weather broke enough to make travel possible, Perry came. Sometimes he brought his ranch hand, a cheerful young man named Denny, to help with tasks that required extra hands. More often he came alone, and they would sit by the fire and she would read to him. She was a better reader than he was, having had more formal schooling. And he would mend things, endlessly, the patient maintenance work that an isolated ranch required in winter, and the evenings were warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fireplace. In January, when a particularly severe storm had kept him at her place for 3 days because the roads were genuinely impassable, They had long conversations about everything. About his plans for the ranch, about what she wanted from the land she had fought for, about whether they were both being as honest as they meant to be with each other about the things that mattered. It was during one of these conversations, on the second snow-held day, that Nellie told him the thing she had not told anyone, that she was afraid of permanence. That Marcus had taught her, in the most thorough and unintentional way possible, that permanence was an illusion, and that attaching yourself to it made you vulnerable in ways that were very difficult to recover from. That when she imagined a future that was built on another person, she felt something tighten in her chest that was not eagerness but fear. Perry was quiet for a long time after she said this. He had his hand still, that rare thing, for him, and he was looking at the fire. "I'm not asking you for permanence as a concept," he said at last. "I'm asking for you to trust what's actually happening between us, which is real and specific and not theoretical." He paused. "I understand that's not easy after what you've been through, but I think you also know the difference between what this is and what Marcus was. You're too honest not to know." She looked at the fire and thought about that. He was right. She did know the difference, had known it for months and had been protecting herself from the knowledge. "I am aware," she said carefully, "that I am in love with you." The silence that followed that statement lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than it needed to. "Good," Perry said. The word came out rough and simple and real, and he turned from the fire to look at her, and the expression on his face was the most undefended she had ever seen him. "Because I have been in love with you since somewhere around the day you shook my hand outside the post office as if it were entirely ordinary and looked at me like you were measuring everything about me simultaneously." She laughed, surprised. "That is an alarmingly accurate description." "You are an alarmingly perceptive person," he said. "I adjusted accordingly early on." She crossed the room and sat next to him on the bench by the fire, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him with a sense of rightness that was so complete and unambiguous that she stopped arguing with it. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, they were warm. Spring came back to Calhoun County in the definitive, mud-soaked way it always did in Montana, and with spring came changes. Holloway, facing the compounding legal pressure from the multiple challenges that had followed Nellie's case, sold his hotel and his feed store and retreated to a quieter position, less aggressive, less predatory. His particular brand of frontier empire building dismantled not dramatically but systematically by the legal process that Nellie and Perry had initiated. Webb's affidavit had opened a door, and other witnesses had walked through it. Justice in the frontier moved slowly and imperfectly, but it did move. Nellie's homestead took shape in the spring in ways that rewarded the previous year's work. The kitchen garden expanded. The grazing lease to Olson was renewed on better terms. She acquired 2 more cows and a small flock of chickens, which added a cheerful, chaotic element to the mornings that she found she did not mind at all. She was building something. It was hers. And for the first time since Marcus died, the future did not feel like a threat to be managed but a thing she was walking toward. Perry proposed to her in April, in the least theatrical way imaginable, which was entirely consistent with his character and made it more, not less, affecting. They had been walking along the river branch at the eastern edge of her property. Their property, informally, in the way of 2 people who have been spending most of their time in the same places, and he had stopped walking and turned to face her with the particular stillness he got when something mattered, and he said, "Nellie, I would like you to marry me. Not because it's practical, not because it makes sense geographically, not for any reason except that I want to live my life in the same direction as yours." She looked at the river, she looked at her hands. She looked at Perry Blackwell, who had appeared outside a post office and fixed her pump and sat at her kitchen table and fought alongside her, and waited with more patience than she had deserved while she worked out what she was capable of. And she thought about trust, about what she had believed about it when she arrived in Harrow Creek and what she understood about it now. Trust was not a decision you made once. It was a practice you maintained. It was daily and it was specific, and it was built from the accumulation of exactly the kinds of moments that Perry had given her, consistently, without drama, over the course of months. He had shown her. That was the thing. Not told her, not promised her, shown her, in the fixed pump and the documents and the affidavit and the evenings by the fire and the way he listened, and the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached out and took both her hands and held them, and she felt the warmth of him steady and real through her palms, and they stood at the river in the April sun for a long time without moving. They were married in June of 1883, at the small church in Harrow Creek, on a day that was exactly the right kind of morning for it, clear and warm with a wind off the mountains that made everything smell alive. Abernathy walked her down the aisle, which was both practical and quietly meaningful. Denny stood up with Perry and cried throughout the ceremony in a way he seemed surprised by and was unable to stop. Nellie's sister had come from Chicago, having received the letter about the pump and correctly interpreted it as a summons, and she stood in the front pew with an expression of profound satisfaction that was not entirely dignified but was entirely sincere. Nellie wore a dress she had made herself from fabric that was the deep blue-gray of Perry's eyes on a cloudy day, a fact she would never tell him because she knew exactly how it would make him smile. She carried flowers from her kitchen garden because they were there, and because she had grown them. She walked down the aisle of the little church and looked at Perry standing at the front, in a clean dark suit that she was fairly certain was the only one he owned, and he was looking at her with that undefended expression that she had first seen on the bench by the fire, and she felt something in her chest that was nothing at all like fear. The judge, Harmon, as it happened, who was in town again on circuit and who had, with dry Montana humor, offered his personal services when he heard the wedding was planned, married them with a minimum of ceremony and a maximum of legal precision, and when he pronounced them married, he looked as satisfied as Nellie imagined a man with a sense of justice could look. Perry kissed her in front of the whole congregation, and it was not brief. The reception was in the churchyard, with the whole town there because the whole town had opinions about these two people, and considered the successful outcome of their story a kind of community victory. There was food and music, a fiddler who could also play harmonica simultaneously, which impressed everyone, and the kind of unself-conscious celebrating that the frontier produced when it had something genuinely worth celebrating. At one point, standing slightly apart from the noise with a glass of cold cider, Nellie looked at Perry beside her and thought about the evening she had stood on this porch, her porch, on this land she had fought for with his rifle barrel between them, and how certain she had been in that moment that she was right to be afraid of him. How certain she had been that she was right to trust no one. How much she had been prepared to lose in exchange for the safety of that certainty. She thought about all the reasons she had not to trust him, and all the reasons he had given her to do it anyway. And she thought about the fact that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is recognize the difference between the fear of the past and the truth of the present, and to choose accordingly. "You are thinking about something complicated," Perry said, watching her. "I am thinking about pump mechanisms," she said. His eyes did the thing they did when she amused him. "That is very romantic, Nellie." "It started there," she said. "Everything started there." He understood. He always understood. He took her hand and turned it palm upward and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, a gesture so private in the middle of a very public afternoon that she felt it everywhere, and she thought that she was going to spend a very long time being surprised by him, which was the best possible thing. They settled into life on the combined property. They did not merge the two ranches formally, but they operated them together, which made both more viable and allowed them to hire Denny full-time, which solved a problem Perry had been managing alone for years. Nellie's land provided the water access and the grazing supplement that Perry's north pasture needed. Perry's cattle operation and equipment provided the capital and capacity that her small homestead had been stretching to manage. Together, it made sense in the way that things make sense when they have been built on honest foundations. She kept her name for legal purposes, Nellie Pritchard, formally, on the property deeds, because that name was on the documents she had fought for, and changing it would have required paperwork she found philosophically unnecessary. In practice, in the town and to everyone who knew them, she was Nellie Blackwell, and she had no particular feeling about either version except that both were hers. They had their first disagreement as a married couple in August, about the acquisition of a second bull, which Perry thought was a necessity and Nellie thought was premature. And she was right, and he conceded it with good grace, which established a productive precedent for their marriage going forward. Their first Christmas as a married couple was quiet and warm and completely wonderful in the way of things that are not dramatic. Perry cut a small pine from the foothills, and they decorated it with ribbon and dried fruit, and a string of wooden beads that had belonged to Perry's mother. And Nellie's sister sent a package from Chicago that arrived 3 days late but contained, among other things, a copy of a novel she had been wanting and a jar of preserved cherries, and a letter so full of her sister's particular voice that Nellie read it twice, and then put it away to read again later. In the spring of 1884, she knew she was expecting a child. She knew it with the same bodily certainty with which she knew weather was changing, a kind of internal knowledge that arrived as fact rather than suspicion. She told Perry on a Saturday morning while they were having coffee, with the same directness she brought to everything, and watched his face go through a sequence of expressions in about 2 seconds that was one of the most unguarded things she had ever witnessed in a human being. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and sat down very close to her and took her hand with a gentleness that she felt in her bones. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am extremely well," she said. "I am also terrified, if that is useful information." "We can be terrified together," he said. "I excel at that." "You do not," she said. "You are the least afraid person I know." "I am very afraid of this," he said. "That is honest." He looked at her, and very, very glad. She understood. She felt both things simultaneously and completely, and that was all right because that was what all the real things felt like. Their son was born in December of 1884, at the homestead, in the iron-cold heart of a Montana winter, with the assistance of the midwife from town and Perry making himself useful in ways that were more effective than most first-time fathers managed, which did not particularly surprise Nellie. They named him James, after Perry's father, with the middle name Marcus, because whatever Marcus Pritchard had been, he was part of the road that had led to this, and Nellie had decided that roads deserved to be acknowledged. James Blackwell arrived in the world with a full head of dark hair and an expression of general displeasure at the proceedings that both his parents found endearing and immediately recognizable as a family trait. He was healthy and loud and absolutely, overwhelmingly real in the way of new people, and Nellie held him in the blue-white quiet of the December morning and felt something so enormous and specific that she did not have a name for it, except that it was the furthest thing imaginable from the woman who had arrived in Harrow Creek with $12 and a dead man's debt. Perry sat beside her on the bed and looked at the two of them with that undefended expression, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed to be said. As months turned and the boy grew, the ranch grew with them. The water rights that Nellie's legal victory had secured proved, over time, to be as significant as Perry had predicted. The river branch access was essential to the north quarter of the county's summer grazing, and several neighboring ranchers negotiated access agreements with the Blackwells that were fair and brought in steady secondary income. Nellie handled these negotiations herself, with the same attention and precision she brought to everything involving documents, and she became known in the county as a person whose word was exactly worth its face value, which was the reputation she had been building toward since she arrived. Denny got married in the fall of 1885 to a woman named Clara who came out from St. Paul on the stage and had a laugh like a very pleased crow, and was, as it turned out, exactly right for him. The Blackwells attended the wedding and danced at the reception, and Nellie danced with Perry to the same fiddler who had played at their own wedding, and thought that some things were worth noticing when they circled back. Holloway moved away from Calhoun County in 1886, quietly and without announcement, in the way of men whose particular kind of influence depends on the specific geography of a place and evaporates when they leave it. The county did not commemorate his departure. Several people who had lost land to his methods had already begun the slow process of legal recovery, some successfully, some not, but the process was happening, and the documentation that Nellie and Perry's case had introduced into the county record was a resource that multiple subsequent challenges drew upon. This was not a thing they had planned. It was simply what happened when you insisted on the truth hard enough and in the right place. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1887, a daughter, who was born in the warmer season with considerably more equanimity about the proceedings than James had demonstrated, as if she had already decided to be the practical one. They named her Ruth, after Nellie's mother. Ruth had her father's stillness and her mother's eyes, and a fierce attachment to the chickens that began almost as soon as she could walk. By the late 1880s, the Blackwell operation was one of the most stable and well-regarded ranches in Calhoun County, which was a thing neither of them had set out to achieve but had arrived at through the compounding of consistent, honest work. They employed 4 people full-time. They had a proper barn. The roof Nellie had repaired with the first money from Marcus's brother's bank draft had been replaced entirely in 1886 with proper materials, and the kitchen garden had expanded to a full acre. The house itself had been added onto twice, a second bedroom when James was born, and a proper parlor in 1887 when Nellie's sister came to visit and could not be asked to sleep in the kitchen. The sister, her name was Clara, a different Clara than Denny's wife, a coincidence the two Claras found mutually amusing when they met, stayed for a month, and Nellie watched her sister look at the life she had built and saw the sister revise whatever she had expected to find. Chicago had opinions about the frontier, largely organized around the categories of deprivation and hardship, and there was deprivation and hardship. Nellie would not pretend otherwise. But there was also the clarity of a life that was unambiguously yours, of work whose results you could see, of a community of people who knew your name and what you were made of, and of a marriage that was, every single day, a choice freely made. Her sister watched Perry with Nellie for 3 days before she took Nellie aside and said, in the direct way of people who love you enough to be honest, "He looks at you like you are the most interesting thing in the room every time you speak." "He is a very attentive person," Nellie said. "He looks at you like that when you're not speaking," her sister said. Nellie did not reply to that, but she thought about it later, standing at the kitchen window in the early morning, watching Perry come in from the barn with the particular walk he had, and she thought about what it was to be known by someone fully, imperfectly, honestly known and chose every day regardless, to be trusted back, as completely as she trusted him. The widow who had had no reason to trust a rancher had found, in the end, every reason. They had not arrived all at once, in some dramatic declaration. They had arrived one at a time, accumulated through months of small, deliberate acts of honesty and care and presence. A fixed pump, a document examined, an offer stated plainly, a hand held, a fire shared in a winter storm, a name spoken in a dark night with a certainty that said you are real and you matter and I am not going anywhere. Trust was not given. It was built. And it was built the same way as everything worth having on the frontier, piece by piece, day by day, with your hands and your attention and your willingness to keep showing up. Nellie turned from the window when she heard James come barreling down the stairs, at the volume James brought to all activities, and Ruth's smaller footsteps following in a more considered manner, and Perry coming through the back door with the cold morning air on his coat and his hat pushed back on his head, and the look of a man who was glad to be exactly where he was. He came into the kitchen and their eyes met over the heads of the children, and she saw in his face everything she had learned to read there. The warmth and the steadiness and the particular quality of love that was not a feeling you had occasionally but a place you lived, that you returned to and rebuilt and chose again every morning. "Coffee's on," she said. "Good morning to you too," he said, and his eyes did the thing and she felt it all the way through her. James demanded breakfast at maximum volume. Ruth was already organizing the bread into a pattern Nellie had not requested. Perry hung up his hat and washed his hands and settled into his chair with the comfortable authority of a man in his own kitchen who knew exactly how lucky he was, and the morning went on in its ordinary, irreplaceable way. Outside, the Montana morning was doing what it always did, arriving with tremendous indifference to the particulars of human joy, and carrying both of them along anyway. The land and the light and the cold river running along the eastern edge of the property that was Nellie's, that she had fought for, that she had won, that was home in every sense the word had ever meant to her. She set a cup of coffee in front of Perry and he caught her hand for a moment as she let go of the cup, just held it for a second and looked at her with the expression she would keep cataloging for the rest of her life and never entirely finish, because there was always something new in it. "Good morning," she said quietly for him. "Good morning," he said, and meant it in all the ways she had learned to hear. James knocked his cup off the table. Ruth calmly picked it up. The day began.